there was room for passengers for about 20 people. And one of the passengers that traveled with us to Brazil was a man called John Cheganovsky. This is his picture. John had on board of the ship a cargo that he was in charge of. There were 3 racehorses from France that were purchased by a very rich person, an industrialist in Brazil, who wanted to have these horses in the São Paulo Jockey Club. So the owner of these 3 horses, one of them was called Violoncel and had made lots and lots of money racing in France. So when these horses were purchased in Europe by this Brazilian industrialist, a baron by title too, he made a contract with the trainer. Horses need jockeys and they need a trainer. And John grew up amid horses on his estate somewhere in the area of the capital, the Polish capital, Warsaw. So when he was coming with these horses, we met him on board this ship and became lifelong friends. When we arrived in Brazil, he debarked with his horses and we lost track of John. It was about a month or 2 after we had arrived in São Paulo, we met up with John for some reason that I don't know why we met, whether he called us or it was a chance meeting. But here is all of a sudden a new acquaintanceship with our traveler on board the ship, John Cheganovsky. And he asked us how we were doing, and we enjoyed the renewed getting together. And then he asked us if we would be willing to rent a room. We had an extra room in the house that we are renting from a Brazilian. And we had a 3-bedroom home, but we had only Tiek and me as the dwellers in that house. We then rented a room. At that time, of course, Tiek was now getting pretty pregnant. And we were happy with having someone at home with a car. I had not enough income to buy in Brazil any car. I worked from early in the morning, about 7, leaving my place in the suburb of metropolis São Paulo with millions of people and big skyscrapers like Manhattan. And I would not be back. I was using public transportation, a tram that took me from my place called Brooklyn. And then an hour or so later, hour and a half later, I ended up in the Goodyear rubber and tire factory. And it would take me till about 7 at night in the evening before I would manage to get back to my own home and meet up with Tiek. So you can see that it was very helpful to have John in the house with a car in case of birth of the baby, and I'm not there far away from the house in another suburb of São Paulo, where the factory was of Goodyear. At one time, in August of 1952, I came home. I was brought back home by the American colleagues of mine that who lived around in the area of Brooklyn as well, having American cars, all brought in, imported from the U.S. That was all paid for by Goodyear. And these people dropped me off and I found out that there was no wife waiting for me, nor John. There was a note that said, "We are at the hospital. The baby is being born." So I was really happy that that was taken care of when I wasn't there. And then I took a transportation, a tram that went downtown Sao Paulo, and it was called a Bondi, Bondi. I took the Bondi to downtown Sao Paulo, which took a while, and ended up walking a while to get to the hospital. And there was a special room reserved for Tiek. And I arrived there with John sitting next to Tiek. So the nurse then, jokingly, I guess, I'm not sure whether she knew or not, which one of the two of you is the father? So anyway, that was fun. And John had bought some alcoholic champagne, which was, of course, immediately removed from my wife, Tiek. There was no alcohol for the birth-giving mother. There was a custom, and there it probably still is today, that the father always during the birth process would have a bed next to his wife. And that was the same with me. So I slept in the room, in the hospital room. John went back home because in the morning he had to start training the horses very early. In the morning, the baby was coming out, and I was in the birth room with my wife, of course, and stood at her foot end when the baby arrived. The baby's name, Miriam. My first child was a daughter. And the first thing that I heard the doctor say, careca, means baldy. There was no hair on the head of the baby. So I thought, maybe that is a good name. I didn't know that it meant baldy. I thought that sounds like a nice name for a girl, careca. So I learned quickly that it's not meant as a name. We entered back home afterwards, and there was John having set up everything nice for the welcoming, the flowers. He had made breakfast for us coming back. So that's why I always have great memories of this renter, stranger, not so long ago to us, and now being a good friend, helping out wherever he could. He had a friend, and a lady friend from Poland, and he brought her in as an assistant to Tiek in babysitting, preparing meals, and everything that she was willing to do, cleaning, vacuum cleaning, doing the laundry, just whatever needed to be done so that Teek didn't have to work. We lost track of John over the years. When we moved eventually after a year and a half in Sao Paulo to a new job where I became administrator of a Dutch agricultural cooperative. This cooperative was formed by 50 Dutch immigrants, immigrants from the north of the Netherlands who did not feel they want to stay in Europe, and they had an opportunity to leave overcrowded Netherlands with the help of the Dutch government to immigrate from their place in the Netherlands, in the north of the Netherlands, and settle on Brazilian prairie ground, endless room for farming that was not used at all other than for herd cattle grazing. These people arrived from the Netherlands in groups of about 3 farmers at the time. When they arrived by ship into a state south of Sao Paulo called Estado do Paraná. There is a big river in Paraná, and the state was called for this particular river. Those farmers had large families. There was one particular who had over 10, I forgot, 12 or 13 children. And the smaller ones had 4 or 5 children. The farmers were wealthy in the Netherlands. They did not leave because they were poor, but they felt that if they would move to a large area, that they could split up that area for their children, which was no longer possible in the Netherlands because over ages the areas were gone. Holland was overpopulated, and there was a great wave of Dutch people after the war who had seen enough, had been suffering enough by 5 years of occupation and also the fear of the Soviet Union communism gobbling up the rest of Europe. It was really a fear that I have felt myself, and I can understand that these farmers said, let's go. And they had a chance to go to Canada with the help of the Dutch government, who was encouraging anyone in the Netherlands go. And so there was financial help. In this case, the farmers were transported by the same company that took me to Brazil, and they got a free ride for them with their entire family and their farm equipment and their high pedigree cattle to move from the Netherlands to Brazil, to, in this case, the state of Paraná, where they then were allotted a huge plot of land that didn't cost them anything because the Brazilian state, Paraná, the governor, was very much aware of the value of Dutch farming. Who These people did everything scientifically, and it was not a fly-by-night farming by some farmer who knew hardly what he was doing. These people all had a good uh, academic background, vocational schools. Anyone in a Dutch farm knew what he was doing, and even veterinarian knowledge, what to do with calves being born in a difficult way. They would stick their arm right into the calf, turn the calf around, and then start pulling it out and so forth. So those people were well known, like worldwide. The Dutch were very good in farming and dairy farming, particularly making all sorts of different dairy products like cheese, chocolate milk, and whatever. So these farmers arrived with all their capital equipment in the center of the state of Paraná. And then they had to do it the way they thought that was the best way to get some produce from the prairie ground and an undulating prairie. It wasn't all flat, but it was undulating, hills, hilly, not high, but that was what they had to work with from start. It was a difficult job. The first three farmers would plow their own fields and then also, in addition, would plow the next three farm families would find plowed area for them. So it was already. And then when they arrived, they would do the same thing for the next group of three farm families. They needed to build houses and barns, all that. The first group had to do it for themselves. There was no one who did it for them, but also did it for the next three comers, the people, the immigrants that were coming. It was well thought out. And this was all done under the auspices, under the supervision of the preacher who started this whole project. Was a preacher by the name of Bill Muller, who was an American of Dutch descent from the city Holland in Michigan. And he was there, a church leader, and he knew that there was a colony way back that started right after World War One. Those were poor Dutch farmers who started with nothing almost, and they needed new blood in their colony. And he was the one that made himself the person to help them out. He would immigrate from Holland, Michigan, Bill Muller, and settled in that area where this farm colony had started in the 20s without any help from anyone in the world. And he preached there. It was the Dutch Reformed Church. And Bill was a preacher in that faith. When he had that responsibility, the man was also, before he became a minister, he was a Wall Street broker. So he was financially very savvy what was going on in order to get funds and handle money affairs. When he worked there as a preacher in Brazil for this particular Dutch settlement, he then thought further than just this particular colony. And he said, we need to get new blood near the old settlement. That's how he went to work and decided to bring in 50 new farm families from the Netherlands, fresh from Europe and settle there. The entire area, thousands of acres that were given to this plan, this immigration plan, belonged to one Brazilian fazendero, rancher, fazendero, had thousands of heads of cattle grazing on this particular piece of land. And once a year, a small Cessna airplane would fly over this huge area looking at the wild brown colored beef cattle and make a proposition, an offer. We pay you so much for all these uncounted cattle. And that was made by very big meat companies in the United States. Swift was one of the names that I remember. And they would buy that cattle and then slaughter it, leave enough for a new generation of calves, and do that on a yearly basis or 2 yearly basis. This fazendero, this rancher, had to go to the nearby village Castro to buy milk, cheese, dairy products. And he had plenty meat for his family, but that was it. Not very useful use of ground, of land. So this governor knew that if he would bring in elite, knowledgeable, skillful Dutch farmers that learned the trade over ages in the Netherlands, that he would get something better out of this land than this particular Brazilian that was just wasting land, basically. And these animals that were sold were wild. I was in there when I met some of them attacking me. Cows, they were absolute wild, were big horns, and you better get out of the way because these were not animals that you would stroke. So then when the first wave, the first group of farmers arrived, they needed help, not only financially, because the state gave them their land free, but when you have bare, virgin prairie land, it'll take a while before you get a crop out of it. That costs money. The federal government in Rio de Janeiro said, we pay that first year or 2 or 3 with money, with cruzeiros. That was the money that they used there, cruzeiros. And that was also an enormous help for these farmers who didn't have the cash to pay for farming their land the first couple of years. And then finally, they didn't speak a word of Portuguese. And there is where I entered the picture. Bill Muller had met me at a Dutch Queen's Day. The Dutch have a King Day or a Queen's Day, and at the end of April for years. When Queen Wilhelmina, of course, was the king in the Netherlands, queen in the Netherlands, and during a São Paulo Dutch club meeting, where I was working in São Paulo, meeting up with other Dutch people in a festive way, then I ran into Bill Muller, and he and I talked about the project that he was involved in. And he said, Rob, you have knowledge of the Portuguese language since you have been in here in Goodyear for a year and a half. Would you be willing to work for the Cooperativa Castrolanda? That's the combination of the name, village name Castro, and the name of Hollanda. And I decided that was very interesting to do that. At Goodyear, Sao Paulo, I was in the middle of a huge factory, and I was not thinking I would move fast enough anywhere there. I was still very much in need of more Portuguese knowledge, but I had picked up a whole lot. I paid Goodyear workers who needed more money. I paid them not to go home for lunch. In Brazil, the almoço, which is lunch, almoço, takes 2 hours. One particular guy was offered money by me not to go home, but sit down with me in the factory and read the newspaper and correct my pronunciation and all that. And that paid off well for me. It was worth the little bit of money that I had to part with to pay this boy. And so I was very serious, hardworking. I need to learn Portuguese. The faster, the better. And I did that by paying, and secondly, by being at home. And instead of conversing with my wife, I need to learn Portuguese. So I had grammar books and all that. I couldn't learn it fast enough. And then it paid off when Bill Muller said, we need somewhere in that colony to translate to the Dutch farmers what is legally needed to do their business, and for the farmers to talk to Brazilians who don't speak a word of Dutch. And I was the in between. Plus, there was other work that I could do in being innovative. But anyway, so I was intrigued by what my new future would be. Very challenging, doing something that you're not really educated for, but if you have it, you can do it. And there is where I, of course, admire my wife, who had just settling in Sao Paulo with neighbors, friends, church, to make the move with me, not to an urban area at all. This was pioneering to the umpteenth degree. There was no doctor there in that colony. There was no electricity in that colony. There was the house that we ended up getting had no water line coming in. It had to be brought in a tank on an agricultural wagon and a horse in front of it or a tractor. And that is how I got hot water into the newly built home, but very primitive, very primitive. So that was offered by me to my wife. We'll go to a faraway place, far away from Sao Paulo. We go to a southern state called Paraná, and there is where the colony is. And it takes more than a day by train to get there through the jungle, where if the train would stop, you could hear the roar of the jaguar. That was that far out into no man's land. And on the colony, there was no jungle. That was just the open prairie, endless prairie, and but we have an interesting job to do there. So my lovely wife accepted wherever thou goest. So she went with one child, Miriam, and me, and we ended up in the colony in the summer of 53, 1953. Of course, before I need to find out whether we wanted to live there. I had not been in the colony at all, so we had a reconnaissance trip, the two of us. We dropped our baby Miriam off to a friend in Sao Paulo, and the two of us went by train to Castellana. It took close to more over a day almost to get in a rickety old time train, steam train in the colony. And we met up with the early immigrants there. There were at that time, I mean, six farm families. The rest was still coming. I had an interesting experience. We were giving hospitality with the first farmer family that had arrived. He was kind of the head man that was taken on the task of being the first one to start this 50 farm family immigration. And he was a very nice, very knowledgeable farmer with lots of capital goods there. And they gave us, Tiek and me, their bedroom. Tiek and I, we slept from the very beginning of our marriage in two different beds. I like that best. I would wake up when she would move and vice versa. So all through our married life, we had always two beds. And when I slept in this new bed with my wife, I didn't sleep. So I went down to the ground, to the floor, and I slept on the floor. And in the morning, the farmer's wife opened the door to wake us up and give us something to drink, coffee or something. And she couldn't open the door because I was sleeping on the floor. Whereupon, of course, soon the word spread. It's not a happy couple. We are hiring for this job. I remember that they told us the story years later. We were not sure whether you would be a good person for this colony. After I decided that it was worth my move from a solid job in Sao Paulo to an I don't know what the job will be, they couldn't tell me exactly either, other than you will be the one and only assistant to the board of farmers. And because, they have all that equipment that they brought in, and a cooperative does this. All the money made by these farmers would go in one pot. And then there was going to be made a decision which farmer of these 30 farm families would get help financially or another money for a tractor or for whatever was needed to do the job. And that was, of course, by a number of these farmers also difficult to accept because everyone works in different degrees, hard, medium, or lazy. And you don't want to see your money go to the lazy person. But because they were so close together, where they came from in the same northern provinces of the Netherlands, Friesland, Groningen, Drenthe. These three are the northern provinces of the Netherlands. And they knew each other for centuries. Their families knew each other. So there was a chance that there was going to be warfare eventually in Brazil was probably nil. They were all going to the same church. They had the same consultants. It worked well. And so then the women formed their club, their women's club, which became a bit of a problem for my wife. After we had arrived there, we had accepted the job, and she had to join with these farm women. Well, they unfortunately spoke their dialect, Frisian, Gronings, Drents, not normal all day Dutch that my wife knew to speak. So she was a bit a loner in these women meetings once a month and sat there not understanding what was being discussed or talked about. She never complained about it, but that was a tough time for her to be part of this colony. She gave birth to my second child, Martin, my son, who was born in the bedroom, and there was only a midwife, a Dutch midwife, who was very talented, skilled, but there was no doctor. And you never know what happens at birth. I was aware of the stories from old times that many women died in childbirth because of bacterial problems. And I overdid it somewhat. In order to give birth to a baby, you need to push. And I had at the foot end of her bed, my bedroom there, planks with rope. She could grab the rope, push against the planks, and get the baby out. Well, I knew these planks need to be sterilized, and there was a sterilization fluid. That was to keep the bugs out of from the floors, and it was very pungent. So these planks were soaked in this carbol, Carbol, the carbol. And carbol is used to put ants and any kind of crawling creatures away from the house or in the house. And that's what she had to push up against. And that was in the house, that smell was in the house months after Martin was born. We had two homes in Castrolanda. The start was this one here. And the water had to be brought by tank car placed on a flatbed agricultural wagon with a tractor by the smith. The smith lived a little further on the center. We call this the center of Castrolanda. It was much more primitive, less buildings, but the big picture is when I was already back in the States. That was built years afterwards. And today, there is one or two hotels or motels. And this is a really completed village. Part of my job was organizing cattle expositions for selling Dutch cattle, Dutch calves. All these calves were high pedigreed. The way it was set up is that the colony had two very expensive bulls with a pedigree that went over a long, long time. And these bulls were Frisian type cattle, black, white. And they were huge. And they were used only for fertilization. And the fertilization was artificial for the reason that when a cow in the herd would have a disease like known as brucellose that would contaminate the entire colony with a steer, a bull, getting contaminated. So there was no way that fertilization was done in the natural way. The way that the cows got fertilized was with artificial insemination done by a veterinarian, a Dutchman who had come with the whole group. And that was not without danger because these two bulls had also big names. One was Caesar and the other one was Napoleon. And they were weighing a ton or more. And they were tied with a ring through their nose to the barn wall. And then they were fat and getting better and bigger and all that, and were ready to be giving their sperm to the vet who would, when they jumped on each other, they had the head of one steer kind of rubbing next to the shoulder of his buddy, who would then jump and squirt the sperm right out, and the vet had to be halfway underneath that ton of weight and shove an artificial vagina on his long penis, and the penis would come out as a small string, but long, would come out red and get in, and the vet would have to manage manipulating that vagina over the erected penis, which was at least out by half or more than a half a foot, and so up to a foot. And by doing it wrong, he could break the penis, just fold it somehow, and would lose enormous amount of money when that bull had to be killed because he wouldn't work anymore. So that was very interesting to follow the procedure. I was there when that happened. And the daughter of one of those farmers would hold the bull by its ring in the nose. The girl, like Evie, holding it. You grew up with that, that. But that was the way the cows were giving their calves, in fact, all over the colony. Now, what needed to be done, and they didn't didn't get it in the beginning, the farmers, registration of the fertilization date. That is where I came in. I said, you guys are losing money. That paperwork is not filled out right by you guys. there was an organization, a Brazilian organization in the country that would take care of it from the Amazon all the way down to the south of Brazil. And if that paperwork was done right, there was the money. If they didn't fill it out, the date and what bull did what and so on, because they didn't read Portuguese, they let it lie down. But when I gave them the documentation in a drawer and forgot about it, they didn't do it in the Netherlands, so why now? So the whole situation was a matter for me to educate these Dutch farmers. And otherwise, you have just a piece of meat that comes out. And if you do it right, and you get buyers flying all the way from the Amazon for their ranches, this Dutch calf that they had their eye on, you got money. But when the paperwork didn't look good to them, they just didn't. They don't want it. But might be the perfect cow they wanted, but they couldn't buy it. So there is where I felt good making an impact on the whole colony. So I was kind of the policeman, and I talked tough to these farmers. There is another loss. That calf is probably worth I don't know how much, and it is now no more worth than a piece of meat. And they learn fast. Now, in order to get prospective fazendeiros, rich money from all over Brazil drawing to this Dutch colony, we needed a small airfield so that they could land in Castrolanda in their Cessna or other small airplanes. They were rich enough to buy their own airplanes. So I got the farmers to level a part of the colony and make that an airstrip. And at one time, at the end, before I left the colony, I had a great opportunity to do PR work for this group of Dutchmen. I was contacted by the Scola Militaire, that was the highest group of military ranks, 101. They had decided in Rio to make a trip through their country, Brazil, starting in the Amazon area and coming down to the most southern state, Santa Catarina, that's bordering Paraguay. So these 101 flag officers, colonel on up to admiral, that was the head person of this study group, was an admiral. And they were for weeks, maybe months, I don't know how long it took, traveling through the entire Brazilian country, starting north, coming south. And they asked if they could visit Castrolanda. And that was, of course, a great moment. Out of this group someone would become president of Brazil. And I was put in charge, give them a good welcome. That was basically my job. You speak Portuguese, you can talk to these guys, these highfalutin admiral and his generals. So I made a speech. First, I wrote it in Dutch, and then I went to the bookkeeper of the colony, the accountant in Brazilian, and I had translated my Dutch into Portuguese, and then I had him check the grammar. And then I studied what I wanted to say and tried to remember that without looking at the speech. That worked like a jam. That's in that book too, that if I ever wanted to tell myself, you did well in studying deep and fast this foreign language, Portuguese, that's the proof of the pudding. So they arrived and they drove over the colony, and they saw what was done in a relatively short period of time. These 50 farm families had been established. They had their crops in, they had their cattle in. The dairy factory that they imported from the Netherlands was built. They built at that time cheese, and a large portion of that area of Brazil, of the state of Paraná, was drinking chocolate milk in special containers that was part of the dairy production. So it was running well, very well. And the moment came that I had to make my speech. So the farmers collected themselves at the center of the colony. I stood on top of a chair, and I looked at this distinguished group of military brass, and I made my speech. Now, the theme was understandable that it would come from us. Thank you. It was a huge thank you to the Brazilian federal government, to the state government for everything they had done for this group of Dutchmen. And I just didn't know that, but I had a big nerve with these 101 top Brazilian brass. After I had made my speech, 20 minutes, less than about 15 minutes, there was a Dutch pea soup in the community hall, which was part of the church. They had also built the Dutch Reformed Church. They were all Dutch Reformed, And so now it was a turn. They were eating, finishing, having snaps and all that, and just filled it up as much as I could. And the admiral got up at the table, and he gave his response. And he mentioned, and he was almost in tears, they had traveled for months all through Brazil and heard nothing good about their own country. This didn't come, that help didn't come. There was starvation there, there was sickness there, too many crocodiles that should have been eliminated. They ate children in the Amazon area and all that. Never was there a thank you note for the Brazilian. That they were very nationalistic. They were the top brass, and they're all out of nowhere in Paraná. There was a group that said, "Thank you." So these guys, this guy brought that up, and he said, "We are so happy that we finally ended up into an area where there was some thank you for what we did." So I got to feel very good. And that was the end of that particular moment. And within a couple of weeks, I was on my way to the USA. So that was that part. Eventually, after 2.5 years being employed in this Cooperativa Castrolanda as an administrator, that I decided to move again, hit the trail again, as they say. And I had a good chance to do that. My brother had preceded me immigrating from the Netherlands to Akron, Ohio, and worked for Goodyear there in Akron. And he had, by writing letters with me, we had not much contact in both countries, but we wrote each other by Christmas time. And he had said that I was wasting time in South America instead of going to North America where the future lays. And so eventually, after 2.5 years being in Castrolanda, I just took him up. He invited me to come and immigrate for the second time to North America. And that's what I did. And this is the ship that took me to the United States, the Lloyd Peru. Lloyd Peru was a Brazilian shipping line that had one cabin on board the ship for a passenger, just one. The rest was all coffee. I booked this ship because it was the cheapest way for me to get to the USA. And because it was not loaded full, it had a hard time on the ocean to keep its balance, so to speak. So it was an unpleasant trip. We ended up getting the tail end of a hurricane at Jamaica on the way to the US. And there were a lot of sick personnel on board the ship. And that was very inconvenient because the food had to go from deep under the ship, from the kitchen area. And that was brought up to the one cabin on the bridge, clear to near the bridge. The bridge had the two cabins, one for the captain and the other on the other side of the ship for the passenger, whoever was a passenger. And a lot of that food spilled on the way up the steps, bringing it to my family, who was who were the family was very seasick, but anyway, we made it and we got to the U.S. So our ship that took us to the USA landed in Brooklyn, New York there. And we had a friend in New York that we got to know in the Netherlands. Actually, his wife. The wife was a Dutch woman and she married an American. And he was a minister of the Episcopalian Church in New York. And he was the son of a millionaire. So we knew that at arrival time in Brooklyn, in a small Brazilian boat, there would be someone at the dockside. And that was indeed the case. So here is Roger Gaffin, the minister, alone. His wife stayed at home. And he and I had never met. And I'm looking, when we arrived at the dockside, I looked down from the ship and I see a man standing there with cupping his hands and yelling up to the bridge where I was standing, anything to sue. I didn't know what the word sue meant. Well, that's typical America. You sue every day, every day, everyone. So I said, no, Sue is not on board. And he kept saying, anything, did you get hurt during the trip? No, I'm not. I don't. Your family? No. And so that was the end of this shisty lawyer standing there yelling at me, and I responding the way I thought I was doing right, telling him there is no Sue on board. Anyways, right after he left, walked away, there is Gavin, Roger Gavin, coming and saying, hello, are you Rob? And asking questions about me. And I said, yes, we are here. Glad to see you, Roger. Now, he said, get off the ship and I'll take you home. Well, here was a surprise. The custom officer coming on board, talking to me, he said, I have pictures of your lungs in Brazil, taken in Brazil. I needed to have a picture of what my lungs looked like. They were the size of a stamp. Whereupon, of course, the American person said, this is not allowed. We need them about this big, and so on. So, no, we cannot let you go and enter the US. Your family, yes, we are nice to do that. We are not allowed to do it, but we will do that. And you are under the care of Reverend Gavin. So he believed that I was okay. Now, they left and went to Gavin's house. The man I had never met before. I turned my family over to a stranger and had to stay on board for the next day to go to Staten Island to the big hospital there and get pictures that were the right size. And then after that happened, I then was on my own. I had, fortunately, some dollars on me, of course, before I left Brazil. And I could pay a taxi cab and say, this is the address, and take me there. So that was my entry into the US. Another anecdote that I like to tell is that when the ship entered Brooklyn Harbor, the captain of this ship was a little over 4.5 feet, 5 feet probably. Very small Brazilian who didn't talk English. The harbor pilot had embarked on this ship that brought us to Brooklyn and guided us to the dock. He was a big, husky guy, ex-ship captain. And he is standing next to this little Brazilian guy who I never liked for the reason that on board of the ship, I was allowed to be on the bridge. Passengers are not allowed to be on board of the bridge. You know, there's only for the personnel that steers the ship and the pilot eventually. So the little Brazilian captain was kind of accusing me of kidnapping 2 Brazilians, my 2 kids, one a baby and Martin, 3 years old, something, 2 years old, was accusing me of taking them out of Brazil, taking them, kidnapping them to the country of the Yankees. He was very anti-American, clearly. He didn't like the Yankees. So this man didn't speak English. And when the pilot gave him instructions, starboard, or whatever, you're more this, more that, a degree left, degree right, between the buoys, he then said to me, do you speak Portuguese? I said, yeah, I come from Brazil, so I have 4 years in Brazil. I speak. He said, tell him to go this way or that way and get in. So I was, the unusual situation as a passenger, giving the captain instructions how to enter the harbor of Brooklyn. I never forget that. What a strange coincidence. So the pilot then, another kudo for him, knew I had talked to him, and I said, someone is he asked me, who is picking you up? The pilot asked me that. I said, I hope this minister, Gavin, he will be at the dockside, and I have never met him. Whereupon he said, if no one picks you up, you're my guest at home. Wow. A guy I never met. That was my great welcome more than anything else. If you don't like the US, now you do. So I never forget that moment. He said, you are my guest tonight. We'll take care of you. So then we moored. I got the guy with the cupped hands, anything to sew. He disappeared, and then Gavin showed up, and he left. And I got the next day my pictures and ended up with the destination of Reverend Gavin. That was my entry that first day in the USA.